Welcome to Cafe Tales, Miss Marple and the Murderer Who Burned Hair. Tonight's story begins. But before we dive in, thank you for being here with us. I'm your host, Ailey, and isn't it wonderful how these mysteries bring us together from all corners of the world? Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin the mystery. Chapter 1. Curling tongs, candle wax, and a scream. The late March afternoon had brought with it that peculiar quality of light that seemed to promise spring while still holding winter's chill in its shadows. Miss Jane Marple paused at the entrance to St. Mary Me Parish Hall, her sharp blue eyes taking in the unusual bustle of activity that surrounded what was normally a place of quiet village meetings and subdued church functions. Today, however, the hall fairly hummed with an energy that spoke of feminine enterprise and community spirit. The Women's Institute beauty demonstration was to begin in precisely 10 minutes, and the air was thick with anticipation, face powder, and the faint chemical tang of permanent wave solution. "Jane, my dear!" Lady Bantry's voice rang out across the small foyer. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in a new spring coat of pale green wool, swept toward her old friend with the sort of enthusiasm that always made Miss Marple smile. "Isn't this exciting? I do hope they'll show us something about those new eyebrow pencils everyone's talking about." Miss Marple adjusted her neat black handbag and smiled. "I'm sure it will be most educational, Dolly, though I confess I'm rather curious about the modern techniques myself." The main hall had been transformed for the occasion. A small platform had been set up at the far end, draped with white sheets that gave it an almost clinical appearance. Several chairs were arranged in neat rows, already occupied by the usual suspects of village social life. Mrs. Price Ridley in her invariable black, young Mrs. Clement trying to manage both baby and notebook, and Miss Weatherby clutching her, knitting as though it might escape. On the platform itself, a striking woman in her early 40s was arranging various implements with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. This, Miss Marple knew, must be Mrs. Elaine March, proprietor of Maison Elaine, the rather grand name given to the ladies' salon that had opened on the high street some 6 months ago. Mrs. March was what village gossips kindly termed well-preserved. Her dark hair swept into an elaborate chignon that showcased the sort of professional styling her establishment promised. "Ladies, ladies!" Mrs. March's voice carried the trained projection of someone accustomed to addressing groups. "We shall begin in just a few moments. I do hope you're all as excited as I am to demonstrate some of the latest techniques in beauty care." Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the other figures moving about the platform area. Near the side entrance, a severe-looking woman in her 50s was checking tickets with the methodical precision of someone who had spent her career ensuring that rules were followed. This would be Miss Vera Lang, the retired matron from the county hospital, who had volunteered to help with the organization of the event. Miss Lang's gray hair was pulled back in a style that suggested function over fashion, and her dark dress bore the sort of immaculate pressing that spoke of military-like discipline and personal habits. She moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to authority, checking each ticket against a list and directing late arrivals to their seats with small, economical gestures. "That's Vera Lang," Lady Bantry murmured, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Used to run that hospital ward like a ship. I've heard she can be quite particular about things being done properly." From the side door came the sound of keys jangling, and a sturdy woman in her 30s appeared, carrying a canvas bucket and several rags. This was Mrs. Miriam Dacre, the hall caretaker, whose neat apron and rolled sleeves suggested she was prepared for any cleaning emergency that might arise from the afternoon's proceedings. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who preferred to remain in the background, ensuring that everything ran smoothly without drawing attention to herself. "Miriam's been such a help," observed Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow. "She keeps this place spotless, and she's so reliable. Never complains about the extra work these events create." The most colorful figure on the platform was undoubtedly Mr. Percy Blunt, the village barber, who had arrived carrying a wooden tray laden with what appeared to be professional hairdressing implements. Percy was a small, neat man in his 50s, with a precisely trimmed mustache that advertised his professional skills. He wore his best suit for the occasion, though he had thoughtfully brought along one of his distinctive blue towels, presumably to demonstrate proper barbering techniques. "Percy's brought some of his curling tongs," Lady Bantry noted with interest. "Heated by spirit lamp, you know. Quite the modern touch for a little demonstration." The final member of the platform party was Miss Lily Crowther, the milliner, who had contributed several hat boxes, presumably containing wigs and bonnets, for the before and after portion of the demonstration. Miss Crowther was a thin, nervous woman who kept glancing about as though worried that someone might disturb her carefully arranged contributions. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her experienced eye noting the small details that others might miss, the way Miss Lang checked her watch with increasing frequency, the careful distance Mrs. March maintained from Percy Blunt's spirit-heated implements, the way Mrs. Dacre positioned herself near the vestry door as though ready to retreat at a moment's notice. The vestry itself stood slightly apart from the main hall, its door currently closed. It was a small functional room where the vicar kept his robes and where parish business was often conducted in private. Today it served as a sort of backstage area where final preparations could be made away from the audience's curious eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. March called out, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "we shall begin in just 5 minutes. I do hope you'll find today's demonstration both informative and entertaining." It was then that the scream came. It was not the polite shriek of surprise or delight that might accompany a successful beauty transformation. This was something altogether different, sharp, shocked, and unmistakably filled with genuine horror. It came from the direction of the vestry, cutting through the genteel chatter like a blade through silk. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversation ceased mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison toward the vestry door, and the carefully maintained atmosphere of civilized social gathering evaporated in an instant. Mrs. March stood frozen for a moment, her professional composure deserting her entirely. It was Mrs. Dacre who moved first, her keys already in hand as she hurried toward the vestry door. Several others followed, including Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly observing from the back of the hall. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the deliberate care of someone who knew that haste often led to oversight. By the time she reached the vestry door, a small crowd had gathered, their voices creating a confused murmur of concern and speculation. The vestry door stood open now, revealing a scene that would remain etched in the memory of everyone present. Miss Vera Lang lay on the floor, her severe gray dress arranged with an odd sort of tidiness, as though someone had taken care to preserve her dignity even in death. Her eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling, filled with that particular dulled quality that spoke of life recently departed. But it was not merely the sight of death that created such a profound sense of wrongness in that small room. It was the smell. Sharp, acrid, and unmistakably the reek of burnt hair. The odor clung to the walls, invaded the nostrils, and seemed to coat the very air with its unpleasant presence. On a small side table near the window, a pair of curling tongs lay, innocently, still warm to the touch. Beside them, a small candle guttered in its holder, the wax pulled around its base in irregular drops that had hardened where they fell. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her keen eyes taking in every detail, while the others exclaimed and questioned. and generally did what people do when confronted with the unexpected presence of death. She noted the way Miss Lang's usually immaculate hair showed signs of singeing around the fringe, the small brown spots on the front of her dress that might have been scorch marks, and the curious tidiness of the scene despite its shocking nature. "Someone fetch Inspector Slack," Dr. Haydock commanded, kneeling beside the still form. "And clear this room, please. No one else should come in until the police arrive." As the crowd reluctantly began to disperse, Miss Marple remained for just a moment longer, her experienced eye cataloging details that might prove significant. The smell of burnt hair was already beginning to fade, but something about its intensity and the way it seemed to permeate the room struck her as oddly deliberate, as though someone had been determined to ensure it would be noticed. She stepped back into the main hall where excited conversations had already begun among the disappointed audience members. Lady Bantry appeared at her side, her face pale with shock. "How dreadful, Jane," she whispered. "Poor Miss Lang. Do you think it could have been some sort of accident with those curling tongs?" Miss Marple adjusted her handbag and considered the question with the careful attention she gave to all matters that struck her as not quite right. "Perhaps, my dear," she said quietly. "Though I do find it curious that a curling tong should create quite such a lingering effect. The beauty demonstration, it seemed, would have to wait for another day." Chapter 2. The Comb Tooth That Melted. Inspector Slack arrived at the parish hall with his usual air of brisk authority, his heavy footsteps echoing through the now subdued space, where 20 minutes earlier the ladies of St. Mary Me had been, anticipating an afternoon of beauty tips and genteel entertainment. The inspector was a man who prided himself on efficiency, and his first instinct was always to find the most straightforward explanation for any situation that demanded his attention. "Right then," he announced to the assembled group, pulling out his notebook with a flourish that suggested he expected to have the matter concluded within the hour. "Looks like we've had a bit of an accident with some hairdressing equipment. These things happen when people who don't know what they're doing start playing about with professional tools." Dr. Haydock, who had remained in the vestry to examine the body, emerged looking somewhat less certain than the inspector sounded. "Alfred," he said quietly, "I think you ought to have a proper look before you make any conclusions." Inspector Slack's expression suggested that he considered unsolicited advice from medical men to be an unnecessary complication in what was clearly a simple matter. Nevertheless, he followed Dr. Haydock into the vestry, his voice carrying back through the open door as he surveyed the scene. Curling tongs still warm, candle burning, smell of burnt hair, seemed straightforward enough. Poor woman must have leaned too close, caught her hair in the flame, panicked. His voice trailed off as his attention was caught by something else. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near enough to the vestry door to observe without being intrusive, watched as Inspector Slack's confident manner underwent a subtle shift. He was staring at something on the chair beside the small table, his brow furrowed in the way it always did when reality failed to conform to his initial theories. "Dr. Haydock," he called, "what do you make of this?" The object that had captured the inspector's attention was a lady's comb, pearl-handled and of the sort that had been fashionable some years ago. It lay on the seat of the wooden chair, positioned as though it had been carefully placed there rather than dropped in haste or confusion. But what made it particularly noteworthy was the condition of one of its teeth. Instead of the neat, uniform spacing that characterized the rest of the comb, one tooth had been transformed into something resembling a small dark bead. Miss Marple found herself moving closer to the vestry door, her curiosity overcoming her natural inclination to remain unobtrusive. The comb had clearly been exposed to heat sufficient to alter its very structure, yet it showed no other signs of damage. The remaining teeth were intact, the pearl handle unmarked, and there was no scorching on the chair itself. "That's celluloid," Dr. Haydock observed, leaning over the comb without touching it. You can tell by that particular way it's melted. Horn or bone wouldn't behave like that when heated. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the slight emphasis the doctor placed on his words. She had handled enough household items over her many years to recognize the sweet, slightly medicinal scent that celluloid produced when heated. It was quite distinct from the acrid smell of burnt hair that still lingered in the room, though much fainter now. Inspector Slack picked up the comb with the tip of his pencil, examining the melted tooth with growing puzzlement. Celluloid, you say? And that would melt faster than real horn? Oh, yes, Dr. Haydock confirmed. Celluloid is quite inflammable. It doesn't take much heat to soften it, and once it starts to melt, it can be quite dramatic. But here's the curious thing, Alfred. If this comb had been near enough to a flame to melt one tooth so completely, you'd expect to see some evidence of scorching elsewhere. On the chair, perhaps, or on any fabric nearby. The two men looked around the vestry with renewed attention. The wooden chair showed no signs of heat damage. The curtains that flanked the small window were untouched. Even Miss Lang's clothing, while showing those curious brown spots on the front, bore no indication of the sort of extensive burning that might be expected from an accident severe enough to melt celluloid. Miss Marple found herself thinking of her own experience with household accidents involving heat. She recalled the time her neighbor, Mrs. Bantry, had left a celluloid hairbrush too close to the fire, and how the entire brush had curled and blackened, filling the room with noxious fumes and leaving scorch marks on the mantelpiece. Yet here was a comb with one tooth completely transformed, while everything around it remained pristine. "Inspector?" she ventured, her voice carrying just enough to be heard without seeming forward. "Might I suggest that someone who knew about celluloid would be aware of how it behaves when heated?" Slack turned to look at her, his expression suggesting that he found civilian observations to be generally unhelpful but occasionally worth acknowledging. "And what would you know about such things, Miss Marple?" "Only what any housewife learns over the years," she replied mildly. "Celluloid items require such care around heat sources. One becomes quite conscious of their properties after a mishap or two." She paused, her eyes returning to the comb on the chair. "It does seem curious that the melting should be so precise. In my experience, celluloid tends to be rather dramatic in its behavior once it starts to soften. One would expect more extensive damage, wouldn't you think?" Dr. Haydock nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Marple raises an excellent point. The pattern of damage here is quite specific, almost as though someone held just that one tooth near a flame for just long enough to create this effect." Inspector Slack's confidence was beginning to show cracks. He prided himself on quick solutions, but the evidence in the vestry was proving resistant to simple explanations. The warm curling tongs, the guttering candle, the smell of burnt hair, all of these suggested an accident during hairstyling, but the precisely melted comb tooth, the lack of corresponding scorch marks, and now Miss Lang's position on the floor, which he was beginning to examine more carefully, painted a different picture entirely. "Dr. Haydock," he said finally, "I think you'd better have a closer look at Miss Lang. Tell me exactly how she died." The doctor knelt beside the body once more, this time with the methodical thoroughness of a professional examination, rather than the quick assessment he had made initially. His hands moved carefully over the throat area, and Miss Marple noticed his expression grow increasingly grave. "Alfred," he said quietly, "I don't think this was an accident with curling tongs at all." The vestry fell silent except for the slight sputtering of the candle, which had burned down considerably since their arrival. Inspector Slack waited, his notebook poised, while Dr. Haydock continued his examination. "There are marks on the throat," the doctor continued, "but they're not from burns. They're consistent with ligature strangulation. Someone used something flexible, fabric perhaps, or rope, to compress the windpipe. The positioning is quite clear once you know what to look for. Miss Marple felt a familiar sensation, the slight quickening of interest that always accompanied the recognition that a puzzle was more complex than it first appeared. She glanced around the vestry once more, her mind beginning to catalog the various inconsistencies that were becoming apparent. But the burnt hair smell, Inspector Slack protested, and the singed fringe. Surely that indicates some sort of accident. With the curling equipment? The singeing appears to be post-mortem, Dr. Haydock replied. Applied after death, not before or during. As for the smell... He paused, considering. Well, that could have been created deliberately, couldn't it? To suggest an accident that never actually occurred. The implications of this observation settled over the group like a chill. Someone had not only committed murder, but had gone to considerable trouble to disguise it as an accident. The burnt hair smell, the positioned curling tongs, the melted comb tooth, all of these might be elements of an elaborate deception designed to mislead the investigation. Miss Marple stepped back from the vestry door, her mind already working through the possibilities. She thought of the people who had been present in the hall, their various comings and goings, their access to the vestry, and their knowledge of the equipment being used for the demonstration. The beauty demonstration had been transformed from a social gathering into something far more sinister, and she suspected that the afternoon's revelations were only the beginning of a much more complex mystery. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices a singe at the wrong height. The transformation of the parish hall from the scene of a social gathering to the focus of a murder investigation brought with it all the uncomfortable adjustments that such circumstances demanded. Inspector Slack had cordoned off the vestry with official tape, though this did little to diminish the intense curiosity of those who remained in the main hall, waiting to give their statements, or simply reluctant to leave such unprecedented excitement. Miss Marple found herself in the peculiar position of being both observer and potential witness, a role that afforded her certain advantages in studying the details that might escape. The notice of those more directly involved in the official proceedings. While Inspector Slack questioned the various participants in the beauty demonstration, she occupied herself with what appeared to be idle knitting, but was actually a careful examination of the physical evidence that surrounded them. The vestry. Curtains had caught her attention from the moment Dr. Haydock could confirm that Miss Lang's death was no accident. These were not the heavy formal draperies one might expect in a church setting, but rather practical cotton panels in a modest floral pattern, designed to provide privacy for the vicar when he changed his vestments or conducted parish business, away from prying eyes. It was while Inspector Slack was taking down Percy, Blunt's rather flustered account of his whereabouts, that Miss Marple's keen eyes detected something that made her set down her knitting with unusual abruptness. Near the hem of the left curtain, at a height that would correspond roughly to her knee when standing, was a small dark spot no larger than a pinhead. The spot was barely visible against the patterned fabric, and Miss Marple suspected it might have gone unnoticed entirely by someone not specifically looking for such details. But her many years of examining household items for signs of wear, damage, or careless treatment had trained her eye to spot even the most minute irregularities. Rising from her chair with the deliberate care of someone who wished to appear merely restless rather than investigatively purposeful, she approached the vestry entrance. Inspector Slack was still occupied with his questioning, and Dr. Haydock was completing his preliminary examination of the scene. The positioning afforded her a clear view of the curtains without seeming to interfere with official business. The singe spot was indeed at knee height, precisely the sort of mark that might be left by a small flame held close to the fabric. But this raised immediate questions about the supposed accident with the curling tongs. If Miss Lang had been styling her hair when tragedy struck, any scorch marks would logically be found at shoulder or head height, where her hair would naturally fall during such an activity. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the floorboards beneath the curtain, where something had caught the light in an unusual way. Kneeling with the careful movements of someone examining a dropped stitch, she discovered several small hardened drops of what appeared to be candle wax. These were not positioned directly beneath the candlestick on the side table, but rather some inches away, near the base of the wall. The pattern of wax drips suggested that someone had moved about the vestry while carrying a lighted candle, allowing the melted wax to fall where it would as they went about their business. This was curious in itself, as the vestry was adequately lit by its window during daylight hours, and the single candle on the table would have provided sufficient illumination. For any normal activity, find something interesting, Miss Marple? Dr. Haydock's voice startled her slightly, though she was pleased to note that his tone carried curiosity rather than criticism. Perhaps, Doctor, she replied, rising from her examination of the floor. I was wondering about the height of this scorch mark on the curtain. It seems rather low for an accident involving hairstyling, doesn't it? Dr. Haydock examined the spot she indicated, his medical training lending itself well to the careful observation of physical evidence. You're quite right, he said thoughtfully. If someone were curling their hair and it caught fire, you'd expect any marks to be much higher up. This is at the level where someone might hold a candle or small flame while crouching or kneeling. The eye. Implications of this observation were not lost on either of them. Someone had been in the vestry with a small controlled flame, working at floor level rather than at the height one would associate with hairdressing. This suggested deliberate activity rather than accidental mishap. Miss Marple returned her attention to the wax drops on the floor, noting their distribution and the way they had pulled as they cooled. Doctor, would you say these wax strips were made recently, within the last hour or so? Dr. Haydock knelt to examine the evidence more closely. I should think so, yes. They're still quite soft in the center, though the outer edges have hardened. Fresh enough that they would have been liquid when the demonstration was scheduled to begin. This timing was significant. If someone had been moving about the vestry with a lighted candle shortly before the beauty demonstration commenced, it suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous action. The murderer had not simply taken advantage of an unexpected opportunity, but had planned their actions with sufficient forethought to prepare the scene in advance. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack's voice interrupted her contemplations. I understand. You were one of the first to respond when the scream was heard. Did you notice anything particular about the scene when you arrived? She considered the question carefully before responding. The smell of burnt hair was quite pronounced, Inspector, much stronger than one might expect from a brief accident with curling tongs. It seemed to linger in the air as though it had been deliberately created. Deliberately created? Slack's eyebrows rose skeptically. How does one deliberately create the smell of burnt hair? By burning hair, I should think, Miss Marple replied mildly. The question is, whose hair and why someone would wish to create such an effect? She gestured toward the low scorch mark on the curtain and the scattered wax drops. If someone held a small flame near the floor level, perhaps they were burning something small, a snippet of hair, perhaps, to create the odor that would support the impression of an accident. The logic was compelling, though Inspector Slack looked reluctant to abandon his preference for straightforward explanations. But why go to such elaborate lengths? If someone wanted to murder Miss Lang, why not simply do so, and leave it at that? Because, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently, the timing was crucial. The beauty demonstration was about to begin, with dozens of witnesses present. If Miss Lang's death appeared to be an accident that occurred just moments before she was discovered, no one would think to question the whereabouts of the various participants during the earlier part of the afternoon. She paused, allowing this to sink in. But if it became obvious that she had been murdered sometime earlier, you would need to account for everyone's movements over a much longer period. The burnt hair smell served as a sort of temporal misdirection, suggesting the death occurred at a specific moment rather than at some earlier time. Dr. Haydock nodded approvingly. Quite ingenious, really. Create a distinctive sensory impression that would naturally be associated with the supposed time of death, while the actual murder could have taken place considerably earlier. As if to emphasize the point, the lingering smell of burnt hair had now faded almost entirely, leaving only the normal church scent of old wood, candle wax, and the faint mustiness that accompanied any building of considerable age. Inspector Slack made several notes in his book, though his expression suggested he found the complexity of the deception somewhat overwhelming. Murder cases in St. Mary were typically straightforward affairs involving obvious motives and readily apparent evidence. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked, but her mind remained focused on the curious combination of deliberate deception and careful timing that had characterized this crime. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to mislead the investigation, which suggested both premeditation and a detailed knowledge of how such investigations typically proceeded. Chapter 4. The Barber's Blue Towel. The systematic questioning of witnesses had begun in earnest, and Inspector Slack had established himself at one of the tables in the main hall, his notebook open, and his manner suggesting the sort of methodical efficiency that he hoped would bring rapid results. The remaining participants in the aborted beauty demonstration sat in a loose semicircle, each waiting their turn to provide what information they could about the afternoon's tragic events. Percy Blunt was the first to be called forward, his small frame appearing even more compact than usual as he perched nervously on the edge of his chair. The village barber had exchanged his professional confidence for the uncertain demeanor of someone who found himself unexpectedly involved in matters far removed from his usual expertise with scissors and razors. "Now then, Mr. Blunt, Inspector," Slack began, "I understand you brought some equipment for today's demonstration. Curling tongs, was it?" "That's right, Inspector," Percy replied, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Mrs. March asked if I could provide some professional implements. Show the ladies how proper heated styling is done. I brought my best spirit-heated tongs and a display tray. I was very careful with the spirit lamp. 20 years in the trade, you learn to respect hot metal, if you understand my meaning." Inspector Slack made a note. "Did you go into the vestry at any point during the afternoon?" "The vestry?" Percy's voice rose slightly. "No, Inspector, I had no call to go in there. My business was on the platform with the demonstration equipment." Miss Marple, who had been following this exchange while maintaining the appearance of concentration on her knitting, noticed something that made her needles pause mid-stitch. Hanging on a peg near the vestry door was what appeared to be one of Percy's distinctive blue towels, the sort that bore the name Blunt's Barber Shop, in neat white lettering along one edge. The towel's presence was not remarkable in itself. Percy had mentioned bringing professional accessories for the demonstration. What drew Miss Marple's attention was a faint discoloration along one corner of the towel, a brownish smear that seemed oddly out of place on what should have been a freshly laundered item brought for public display. "Inspector," she said quietly, waiting for a natural pause in the questioning, "might I draw your attention to something?" Slack looked up from his notes with the resigned expression of someone who had learned that Miss Marple's observations however inconvenient, were generally worth considering. What is it now? Mr. Blunt's towel there on the peg. I noticed it appears to have some sort of staining on it. Percy's head swiveled toward the vestry door, and his face took on an expression of genuine puzzlement. That's odd, he said slowly. I brought that towel fresh from the shop this morning. It was clean as a whistle when I hung it up. Inspector Slack rose to examine the towel more closely, lifting it from the peg with careful attention to the stained corner. In addition to the brownish smear, there appeared to be a small area where the fabric showed signs of heat damage. Not extensive, but definite evidence that it had been exposed to flame or extreme temperature. Mr. Blunt, the inspector said, holding up the towel, can you explain how this staining and singeing might have occurred? Percy examined the damage with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to dealing with the effects of various hair treatments and styling products. I've never seen that before, Inspector. That brown mark, it almost looks like it could be from hair paste or brilliantine, but the singeing, well, that's not something that would happen in normal barbering. Dr. Haydock approached to examine the towel as well. The pattern of staining is interesting, he observed. It's not the sort of random damage you'd expect from accidental contact with heat. This looks more deliberate, as though the towel was used for something specific and then exposed to flame afterward. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the various uses to which a barber's towel might be put. In Percy's shop, such towels served multiple purposes, protecting clothing, wiping away excess hair and products, and providing the firm grip necessary for precise movements during cutting and styling. Inspector, she ventured, might not a towel also be used as a ligature? The fabric is strong and the size would make it easy to handle. The suggestion hung in the air with uncomfortable implications. You're suggesting this towel might have been used to strangle Miss Lang? He asked. I'm suggesting it's possible, Miss Marple replied carefully. The brown staining could be from contact with hair products, and the singeing might have occurred when someone attempted to eliminate evidence by briefly exposing it to flame. Percy Blunt's face had grown progressively paler during this exchange. But, Inspector, I never went near the vestry. I was on the platform the whole time, setting up my equipment, and then what, Mr. Blunt? Well, I realized I'd forgotten to bring matches for lighting the spirit lamp. I had to slip out to the blue board to get some, but that was before the demonstration was meant to start. This revelation prompted a flurry of note-taking from Inspector Slack. How long were you gone? Not more than 10 minutes, I should think. Just long enough to walk to the pub, get a book of matches from Harry behind the bar, and walk back. I was anxious not to delay the proceedings. Miss Marple considered the timeline this created. Percy's absence to fetch matches would have provided an opportunity for someone else to use his towel for purposes other than barbering. But it also raised questions about Percy himself. Had his trip to the Blue Boar been genuine necessity or a calculated alibi? The matches you obtained, she said, would they be the sort that leave distinctive marks when struck? Just ordinary pub matches, Miss Marple. Harry keeps them behind the bar for the customers who smoke pipes. Inspector Slack was already making arrangements to verify Percy's story with the publican at the Blue Boar. The beauty of a small village was that movements and timings could usually be corroborated by multiple witnesses, but this same characteristic meant that alibis could be constructed with relative ease by someone familiar with local habits and schedules. Mrs. Dacre, who had been quietly observing from her position near the cleaning supplies, stepped forward. I might say, Inspector, I did notice Mr. Blunt leaving the hall during the setup time. I was arranging my buckets and rags and I saw him go out the side door. And did you see him return? I believe so. Yes, though I was rather busy with my own preparations. The caretaker's confirmation of Percy's movements provided some verification of his account, but Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Dacre's attention had been divided between multiple tasks. In her experience, people often saw what they expected to see, especially when distracted by their own responsibilities. The singed towel represented another piece in the increasingly complex puzzle of Miss Lang's death. Like the melted comb tooth and the low scorch mark on the curtain, it suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous action. Someone had anticipated the need to eliminate evidence and had taken steps to do so, though not with complete success. Inspector Slack folded the towel carefully and placed it with the other evidence he was accumulating. The case was proving far more intricate than his initial assessment had suggested, and Miss Marple could see that he was beginning to appreciate the methodical intelligence behind the crime they were investigating. Chapter 5. A bonnet box that was too light. The questioning had moved on to Miss Lily Crowther, whose nervous disposition seemed to have intensified considerably since the discovery of the murder. The milliner sat rigidly upright in her chair, her thin hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles showed white beneath the skin. She had the appearance of someone who wished fervently to be anywhere else, but found herself trapped by circumstances beyond her control. "Miss Crowther," Inspector Slack began in what he clearly intended to be a reassuring tone, "I understand you contributed some items for the beauty demonstration today. Hat boxes, wasn't it?" "Yes, Inspector," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. March thought it would be instructive to show the ladies how different hairstyles complement various hat styles. I brought several pieces from my shop, including some theatrical wigs for the transformation portion of the demonstration." Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the hat boxes that Miss Crowther had arranged near the platform. There were 3 of them, each bearing the neat label L. Crowther Milliner in gold lettering. 2 of the boxes appeared to sit firmly on their bases, suggesting substantial contents, but the third seemed somehow less settled, as though it might be lighter than its companions. "And these boxes contain?" Inspector Slack prompted. "Various bonnets and caps, Inspector, and one contained a demonstration wig, a rather nice piece in dark brown hair that I thought would suit the complexion of whoever volunteered for the styling demonstration." Lady Bantry, who had been listening to the proceedings with the focused attention of someone determined not to miss any detail, leaned forward slightly. "I remember you mentioning that wig at the coffee morning last week, Lily. You said it was quite realistic, made from real hair rather than those dreadful synthetic materials." "That's correct, Lady Bantry. It was a rather expensive piece acquired from a theatrical supplier in London. The hair was genuine, which gives such a natural appearance when properly styled." Miss Marple rose from her chair with a slow deliberation of someone whose joints required careful management, but her movement toward the hat boxes was purposeful rather than merely restless. "Miss Crowther, might I examine your boxes? I find myself curious about the demonstration materials." The milliner's already pale complexion seemed to lose what little color it retained. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I'm not sure what you might find of interest." The first 2 boxes, when lifted, had the solid weight that Miss Marple expected from containers holding substantial millinery items. The third box, however, felt remarkably light. So light, in fact, that she might have thought it empty were it not for a subtle shifting sound when she moved it. "This box seems rather lighter than the others," she observed. "Might I look inside?" Miss Crowther's permission came in the form of a barely perceptible nod, and Miss Marple carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were several loose strands of dark brown hair and what appeared to be a paper band or label, but the substantial wig that should have occupied the box was conspicuously absent. "Miss Crowther," Inspector Slack said, his voice taking on a sharp edge, "where is the wig that should be in this box?" I don't understand, Inspector. It was there when I packed the boxes this morning. Perhaps someone moved it during the setup." Lady Bantry, whose memory for social details was remarkably precise, spoke up from her position near the wall. "But Lily, I distinctly remember you checking that particular box when you arrived. You opened it briefly and seemed satisfied with the contents." Miss Marple was examining the loose strands of hair that remained in the box. They were indeed of excellent quality, with the natural irregularity and texture that distinguished real hair from artificial materials. But there was something else. A few of the strands showed signs of having been cut or broken recently, with fresh ends that had not yet acquired the slightly rounded appearance that hair develops over time. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we may have found the source of our burnt hair smell." The implications were immediately apparent to everyone present. If someone had removed hair from Miss Crowther's demonstration wig and used it to create the false evidence of an accident, it would explain both the missing wig and the particularly strong odor that had pervaded the vestry. But who would know? "About the wig?" Inspector Slack asked. "And who would have access to it?" Miss Crowther's voice was barely audible. Anyone who was helping with the setup might have seen it. "I mentioned it to several people when I was arranging my contributions on the platform. Miss Marple was thinking about the timeline of events. The wig hair would have needed to be harvested before the demonstration began, suggesting that the murder had been planned in advance rather than committed on impulse. Someone had known about Miss Crowther's contribution and had specifically targeted it as a source of material for their deception." "Miss Crowther," she said gently, "when you checked your box upon arrival, was the wig definitely present then?" "Yes, I'm quite certain. I always verify my demonstration materials before any public presentation." "And after that check, did you remain with your boxes constantly?" The milliner's distress was evident as she struggled to recall the sequence of events. "Not constantly, no. There was such a bustle of preparation, and Mrs. March asked me to help arrange chairs while she organized the platform. I suppose my boxes were unattended for several minutes at a time." Lady Bantry had been following this exchange with growing comprehension. "Jane, are you suggesting that someone deliberately took hair from Lily's wig to burn in the vestry?" "It seems the most logical explanation for the missing wig and the intensity of the burnt hair odor we all noticed," Miss Marple replied. "Real hair burns with a much stronger and more persistent smell than one might achieve with a few singed strands from an actual accident." Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to the discussion while continuing his examination of the physical evidence, looked up from his notes. "That would certainly explain the discrepancy I noticed. The amount of singeing on Miss Lang's hair was quite minimal, yet the smell in the vestry was much stronger than such limited burning would produce." Inspector Slack was making rapid notes, his earlier confidence in a simple, accidental death now completely abandoned. "So someone planned this murder in advance, prepared false evidence to suggest an accident, and executed their plan during the setup for the beauty demonstration?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It appears so, Inspector. The question now becomes, who had the knowledge, opportunity, and motive to commit such an elaborate deception?" She looked around at the assembled group. Mrs. March, with her professional composure now thoroughly shaken, Percy Blunt, still pale from the discovery about his towel, Mrs. Dacre, quietly efficient in her corner, and Miss Crowther, trembling with distress over her missing wig. Somewhere among these seemingly ordinary villagers was someone capable of careful planning, cold-blooded execution, and the sort of methodical thinking required to stage an elaborate false scene. The beauty demonstration had provided the perfect cover for murder, but it had also created a web of evidence that was beginning to reveal the careful intelligence behind the crime. Chapter 6. The gas ring turned low. The discovery of the missing wig had cast a new light on the entire investigation, and Inspector Slack found himself grappling with the uncomfortable realization that what he had initially dismissed as a simple accident was proving to be a crime of considerable sophistication. The methodical nature of the deception suggested someone with both patience and detailed knowledge of how such investigations typically proceeded. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had developed that particular expression of quiet concentration that those who knew her had learned to recognize as the precursor to significant insight. She had excused herself from the immediate vicinity of the questioning and was now engaged in what appeared to be a casual exploration of the parish hall's various amenities. The hall's small kitchenette was tucked away behind the main room, a practical addition that had been installed some years earlier to facilitate the serving of tea and light refreshments at parish functions. It was equipped with the basic necessities: a sink, some cupboard space, and a gas ring that served for heating water and preparing simple items. As Miss Marple approached the kitchenette, she noticed immediately that the gas ring was lit, burning, with the steady blue flame that indicated it had been turned to a low setting. Above the flame sat a small spirit pan of the sort used for heating curling tongs and other hairdressing implements. The pan appeared to have been in use recently, as evidenced by a slight residue around its base and the lingering warmth that radiated from its surface. This discovery struck her as particularly significant when considered alongside Percy Blunt's earlier testimony about his methods for heating curling tongs. The village barber had been quite specific about using a spirit lamp for his professional work, emphasizing his preference for the controlled heat that such equipment provided. "Inspector," she called softly, "might I trouble you to examine something in the kitchenette?" Slack approached with the weary expression of someone who was beginning to suspect that each new piece of evidence would only serve to complicate matters further. "What is it now, Miss Marple?" "The gas ring here has been burning, and there's a spirit pan positioned above it. I find this curious given Mr. Blunt's assertion that he heats his curling tongs using a spirit lamp rather than gas flame." Inspector Slack examined the setup with growing puzzlement. "Blunt," he called, "come here and explain this to me." Percy Blunt approached the kitchenette with obvious reluctance, his earlier nervous demeanor intensifying as he took in the scene before him. "That's not my setup, Inspector. I never use gas rings for heating tongs. Far too unpredictable for professional work. I brought my own spirit lamp, as I mentioned." "Then who set this up?" Slack demanded. Miss Marple was examining the spirit pan more closely, noting that while it showed signs of recent use, it was not particularly hot. "Inspector, I believe this pan has been used to keep something warm rather than to heat it initially. The temperature is quite moderate, enough to maintain warmth but not sufficient for the initial heating that curling tongs would require." Dr. Haydock, who had joined the group in the kitchenette, tested the temperature of the pan handle with a careful touch. "Miss Marple is quite right. This has been warming gently for some time, but it hasn't been subjected to the intense heat you'd need for professional hairstyling." The implications were becoming clear to those assembled. Someone had used the gas ring and spirit pan to maintain a moderate temperature on certain implements, creating the impression of recent use without the telltale signs of extremely high heat that would accompany genuine curling tong work. "The curling tongs in the vestry," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "were described as warm to the touch. Were they not hot, as they would be immediately after use, but comfortably warm?" Inspector Slack consulted his notes. "That's correct. Dr. Haydock mentioned they were warm but not burning hot." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple continued, Someone used this arrangement to keep the tongs at a temperature that would suggest recent use without actually heating them to the degree necessary for hairstyling. The gas ring provided a gentle, controlled heat that could maintain the deception over a longer period. Percy Blunt was shaking his head with increasing vigor. "But, Inspector, I never touched that gas ring. My spirit lamp was set up on the platform, and I was very particular about keeping my equipment together. I've been using the same methods for 20 years. I wouldn't suddenly change my approach for a demonstration." Mrs. Dacre, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward. "If I might say, Inspector, I did notice someone moving about in the kitchenette during the setup period. I thought perhaps they were preparing for tea service later." "Did you see who it was?" Slack asked. "I'm afraid I was rather busy with my own preparations," Mrs. Dacre replied. "I noticed the activity, but didn't pay particular attention to the individual involved." Miss Marple found herself considering the timeline that was emerging. Someone had taken considerable care to prepare multiple elements of the deception. The harvesting of hair from Miss Crowther's wig, the preparation of the gas ring set up to maintain moderate heat on the curling tongs, and the creation of the various physical evidence that would support the appearance of an accident. "Inspector," she said, "I believe we're dealing with someone who understood that a successful deception requires attention to multiple details. They knew that investigators would check the temperature of the curling tongs, so they ensured the tongs would be warm. They knew that the smell of burnt hair would be expected, so they prepared material from the demonstration wig. They even anticipated that timing would be crucial, so they created a method for maintaining the illusion over an extended period." The sophistication of the planning was becoming increasingly apparent. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity, but rather a carefully orchestrated sequence of events designed to mislead the investigation from the very beginning. Dr. Haydock was examining the soot residue on the spirit pan with professional interest. "This pan has definitely been used for heating something, but the pattern of residue suggests it wasn't the curling tongs themselves. The shape and distribution of the soot marks indicate something smaller and more irregular." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps the same small flame that created the scorch mark on the vestry curtain. Someone could have used this setup to prepare their materials in advance, then carried out the final staging in the vestry itself." The gas ring continued to burn steadily, its blue flame a testament to the methodical preparation that had characterized every aspect of this elaborate crime. Somewhere among the assembled villagers was someone who had demonstrated not only the willingness to commit murder, but the intelligence and patience to construct an intricate web of false evidence designed to protect them from detection. Chapter 7. The Locket with the Wrong Hair. Dr. Haydock's formal examination of Miss Lang's remains had proceeded with a methodical thoroughness that characterized all his professional work, but it was not until he began cataloging her personal effects that a discovery emerged, which would prove to add yet another layer of complexity to an already intricate puzzle. "Inspector," he called from the vestry, where he had been carefully going through the contents of Miss Lang's handbag, "I think you should see this." The handbag itself was a practical affair, black leather with sturdy clasps, the sort of sensible accessory that befitted a woman of Miss Lang's no-nonsense character. Its contents were equally orderly: a purse containing a modest sum, a clean handkerchief, reading spectacles in a worn case, and several other items of the kind that any well-organized woman might carry. But folded neatly in a side compartment was a letter written in Miss Lang's precise handwriting and addressed to the editor of the County Chronicle. The letter bore that day's date and appeared to be ready for posting, suggesting that Miss Lang had intended to mail it following the beauty demonstration. Inspector Slack read the letter with growing interest, his eyebrows rising as he absorbed its contents. "This is about a fire," he announced to the assembled group. "A dormitory fire at something called St. Cyprian's Girls' Home in 1931. Miss Marple felt that familiar quickening of attention that always accompanied the emergence of connections to past events. In her experience, murders in the present were frequently rooted in grievances and secrets from years gone by, and the mention of a tragedy more than 2 decades old suggested that Miss Lang's death might be connected to much older wounds. What? "Does the letter say, Inspector?" Lady Bantry inquired, her natural curiosity overcoming any reluctance to appear forward. Slack cleared his throat and began to read selected portions aloud. "She writes about a matter of conscience that has troubled me for many years and mentions evidence that has come to light regarding the negligence that contributed to the deaths of several children in the St. Cyprian's fire of 1931. The letter goes on to describe Miss Lang's intention to provide the newspaper with details about the incident, including what she termed proof of the responsibility borne by certain individuals whose actions, or lack thereof, contributed to the tragedy. She specifically mentions possessing a mourning brooch containing a child's hair marked with a scarlet thread, which will substantiate the claims I intend to make public." Dr. Haydock looked up from his examination of the letter. She was planning to expose someone, it seems, someone she held responsible for those children's deaths. Miss Marple was considering the implications of this revelation when Miss Crowther's voice broke the thoughtful silence that had settled over the group. "I believe I may have found the brooch Miss Lang mentions," she said quietly, holding up a small Victorian mourning piece that she had discovered tucked behind a hymn book in one of the pews. It was rather oddly placed, as though someone had hidden it hastily. The brooch was indeed of the Victorian mourning type, crafted from jet and gold with a small glass compartment designed to hold a lock of hair from the deceased. Such pieces had been common during the previous century, when the elaborate rituals of mourning required specific jewelry and accessories to mark the various stages of grief. Lady Bantry examined the brooch with the careful attention of someone well-versed in period jewelry. "It's quite a nice piece," she observed. "The sort of thing that would have been expensive when it was made. But Jane, look at this hair. Doesn't it seem rather too perfect?" Miss Marple accepted the brooch and studied its contents through the protective glass. The hair within was indeed suspiciously uniform, with a glossy regularity that characterized the better grades of theatrical wigs, rather than the natural variation one would expect from a child's locks. Moreover, despite Miss Lang's letter mentioning a scarlet thread that would serve as identifying evidence, no such marking was visible among the dark strands. "This isn't the original hair," Miss Marple concluded. "Someone has replaced the contents of this brooch with hair from another source, quite possibly from Miss Crowther's missing wig." The implications were staggering. Not only had the murderer used hair from the demonstration wig to create the false evidence in the vestry, but they had also used additional hair to replace the contents of what appeared to be a crucial piece of evidence in Miss Lang's planned exposé. "Inspector," Slack said, "so someone knew about this letter, knew about the brooch, and took steps to render Miss Lang's evidence worthless by substituting false hair for the original." "More than that," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "They knew exactly what Miss Lang intended to reveal." The letter mentions the scarlet thread as proof, which suggests that the original hair in this brooch contains such a marking. Whoever replaced the hair knew that detail specifically. Dr. Haydock had been studying the letter more carefully. The way this is written suggests Miss Lang had been planning this revelation for some time. She mentions evidence that has come to light, which implies recent discovery rather than long-held knowledge. Miss Marple nodded. Perhaps Miss Lang had recently acquired the brooch, or perhaps she had possessed it for years but only recently decided to make her knowledge public. Either way, someone was desperate to prevent her from carrying out her intention. The connection between the 1931 fire and the present murder was becoming clearer, though many questions remained. Someone among their number had been connected to the tragedy at St. Cyprian's girls' home, and Miss Lang's threatened exposure had provided the motive for her death. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think we need to know more about who was present at St. Cyprian's in 1931. The letter mentions negligence and responsibility, someone whose actions contributed to those children's deaths. That person is very likely our murderer." Mrs. Dacre, who'd been unusually quiet during the discussion of the letter, seemed to shrink further into the background. Her methodical cleaning had ceased entirely, and she stood motionless near her bucket and rags, as though afraid that any movement might draw unwanted attention. The Victorian mourning brooch lay on the table between them, its false contents a testament to the length someone had gone to protect themselves from the consequences of actions taken more than 20 years ago. The beauty demonstration had been intended as an afternoon of harmless entertainment, but it had instead become the stage for a confrontation between past guilt and present justice. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of secrets and the way they festered over time. In her experience, the most dangerous secrets were those that involved the deaths of the innocent, particularly children. Such secrets created wounds that never properly healed, and the guilt they engendered could drive people to desperate measures when threatened with exposure. And somewhere in the parish hall was someone who had lived with the weight of those deaths for more than 2 decades. Someone who had thought their secret buried with the victims of that long-ago fire. Miss Lang's threatened revelation had shattered that illusion of safety, and murder had seemed the only way to preserve the carefully constructed life built upon that foundation of concealed guilt. Chapter 8. A Matchbook from the Blue Boar. The revelation of Miss Lang's intended exposé had transformed the investigation from a puzzle of physical evidence into something altogether more personal and historically complex. Inspector Slack found himself facing the uncomfortable reality that solving this murder would require delving into events that had occurred before many of the current residents of St. Mary Me had even arrived in the village. "We need to verify Mr. Blunt's story about fetching matches," the inspector declared, producing a small cardboard matchbook from his evidence collection. This was found in his jacket pocket. It bears the name of the Blue Boar and appears to have had 2 matches struck from it. Percy Blunt, who had grown increasingly pale throughout the afternoon's revelations, examined the matchbook with obvious recognition. "That's the one Harry gave me, Inspector. I remember particularly because he mentioned they just received a new supply from the brewery. The old ones had been getting rather damp from the pub's humidity." Miss Marple studied the matchbook with interest. The Blue Boar was known for providing such amenities to its customers, particularly those who favored pipes or cigarettes with their afternoon pints. The establishment kept a ready supply behind the bar, and Harry the publican was meticulous about maintaining them in good condition. "2 matches struck, you say," she observed. "That seems rather more than one might require for lighting a single spirit lamp." Percy shifted uncomfortably. "Well, the first one didn't catch properly, Miss Marple. The spirit in the lamp had been sitting for a while, and sometimes it takes a moment to get a good flame established." While Inspector Slack made note of this explanation, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to Mrs. Dacre, who was arranging her cleaning supplies with what seemed like unnecessary precision. The caretaker's key ring caught the light as she moved, revealing among the usual collection of parish keys a small folded hairpin of the sort commonly used by women to secure loose strands during housework. The hairpin itself was unremarkable, but Miss Marple noticed that it appeared to have been recently cleaned, showing the sort of careful attention that suggested it had been exposed to something requiring removal. In her experience, Such meticulous cleaning of small personal items often indicated an attempt to eliminate evidence of their use in activities other than their intended purpose. "Mrs. Dacre," she said quietly, "that's a practical addition to your keyring. I imagine it's quite useful during your cleaning duties." The caretaker's hand stilled on her bucket handle. "Yes, Miss Marple. One's hair can become quite unruly during physical work. The hairpin helps keep things tidy." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then moved toward the vestry, where she had noticed something during her earlier examination that now seemed potentially significant. On the floor, near where the candle had been burning, several small drops of hardened wax had formed an irregular pattern. She had observed these earlier, but now she examined them with renewed attention to their specific characteristics. One particular drop, slightly larger than the others, contained what appeared to be a minute fleck of soot and a tiny fiber that looked distinctly different from the fine materials associated with Mrs. March's salon supplies. The fiber was coarser, more utilitarian in nature, and appeared to be the sort of thread commonly found in work aprons or cleaning garments. "Inspector," she called softly, "might you bring that hairpin from Mrs. Dacre's keyring for comparison with something I found?" Mrs. Dacre's reaction to this request was immediate and telling. Her usually composed demeanor cracked slightly, revealing a flash of something that might have been panic before she regained control of her expression. "I don't see what my hairpin could possibly have to do with anything," she said. But her voice carried a tremor that had not been present in her earlier responses. Inspector Slack approached with the keyring, and Miss Marple carefully compared the hairpin with the wax drop containing the fiber. The match was not exact, but the similarity in texture and color was striking enough to suggest a possible connection. "Mrs. Dacre," Miss Marple said gently, "this wax appears to have captured a fiber from an apron or similar work garment, the type of sturdy material that someone in your profession might wear during cleaning duties." The caretaker's composure was deteriorating rapidly. "I clean the entire hall, Miss Marple. Of course, there might be traces of my clothing materials in various locations. That proves nothing." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed. "But it does suggest that someone wearing such clothing was in the vestry with a lighted candle, allowing wax to drip where it shouldn't naturally fall. You mentioned earlier that you never go near the vestry candles, only cleaning up after other people's messes." Dr. Haydock had been observing this exchange with growing comprehension. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that Mrs. Dacre was in the vestry with a candle for purposes other than routine cleaning?" "I'm suggesting that the physical evidence indicates someone in work clothing spent time in the vestry with a small flame, creating the various marks and residues we've discovered. The question is whether this was part of normal caretaking duties or something altogether different." Mrs. Dacre's hands had begun to tremble slightly as she gripped her cleaning bucket. "I maintain this hall properly, Dr. Haydock, every corner, every surface. If I occasionally need to use a candle for better illumination in dim areas, that's simply part of thorough cleaning." Miss Marple was thinking about the timeline that had emerged throughout their investigation. The various elements of the deception had required careful coordination. The harvesting of hair from Miss Crowther's wig, the preparation of the gas ring setup, the positioning of evidence in the vestry, and the replacement of hair in the morning. Brooch. "Mrs. Dacre," she said thoughtfully, "you would have had access to all areas of the hall during the setup period. Your work naturally takes you into every room, and your presence would not be questioned by anyone preparing for the demonstration." "Of course I had access," Mrs. Dacre replied, her voice becoming defensive. "It's my responsibility to ensure everything is clean and properly arranged. That's what I'm paid to do." Inspector Slack was making rapid notes, clearly beginning to see the pattern that Miss Marple was revealing. Mrs. Dacre, I'm going to need you to account for your movements this afternoon, particularly during the period when the various participants were setting up their equipment. The caretaker's response came slowly, as though she was carefully considering each word. I was preparing the hall as always, Inspector, moving between rooms as needed, ensuring that everything was ready for the ladies' demonstration. Including the vestry? Miss Marple asked quietly. Including all rooms that might be used. Yes. Miss Marple was studying the woman's face with the careful attention she had learned to apply when people's words and expressions failed to align properly. Mrs. Dacre's answers were technically accurate, but they carried the sort of careful precision that often indicated someone choosing their words to avoid, rather than reveal the truth. Mrs. Dacre, she said finally, I believe you knew Miss Lang quite well, much better perhaps than a casual acquaintance formed through parish activities. The effect of this observation was dramatic. Mrs. Dacre's carefully maintained composure crumbled entirely, and she sank heavily onto a nearby chair, her cleaning bucket forgotten at her feet. She was going to destroy everything, Mrs. Dacre whispered, her voice barely audible. After all these years, she was going to ruin lives that had been rebuilt, punish people who had already suffered enough. The admission hung in the air like a confession, though Inspector Slack was careful to proceed methodically rather than assume that emotional breakdown necessarily indicated guilt. Mrs. Dacre, he said formally, I think you need to tell us exactly what happened between you and Miss Lang and how it connects to the events at St. Cyprian's Girls' Home in 1931. Chapter 9. The Scarf That Wouldn't Take a Flame. Mrs. Dacre's emotional collapse had created a moment of profound silence in the parish hall, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing and the distant ticking of the church clock. Inspector Slack recognized the delicate nature of the situation. A confession extracted under duress might prove legally problematic, but the woman's obvious distress suggested that the truth was finally beginning to emerge. Mrs. Dacre, he said carefully, I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence. Do you understand? She nodded mutely, her hands still trembling as she gripped the sides of her chair. Miss Marple, observing the woman's genuine anguish, felt that familiar mixture of compassion and determination that always accompanied her involvement in such tragic circumstances. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, we might allow Mrs. Dacre a moment to compose herself while we examine some of the remaining physical evidence. There are still several details that require clarification before we can fully understand what occurred here today. Percy Blunt, who had been listening to these developments with growing bewilderment, suddenly spoke up. Inspector, I've just remembered something about that old barber's trick I mentioned. The singeing of hair ends to seal them. I haven't used that technique in years, but I did demonstrate it once at the county fair, just as a bit of showmanship. Miss Marple's attention sharpened immediately. Mr. Blunt, could you describe exactly how such a technique works? Well, Miss Marple, you take just a few strands of hair and pass them quickly through a flame. Not enough to burn them completely, mind you. Just enough to seal the ends and prevent splitting. It's mostly for show these days, since we have better methods, but it does create quite a distinctive smell. And this technique could be performed with any small flame. Oh yes, he added. A candle would do perfectly well, though you'd want to be careful about the timing. Too long in the flame, and you'd burn the hair completely. Too brief, and you wouldn't achieve the proper effect. Lady Bantry, who had been following this technical discussion with interest, suddenly reached for her silk scarf. Jane, might we try a small experiment? I'm curious about something. Miss Marple accepted the offered scarf with understanding, recognizing that her friend had arrived at a similar conclusion about the nature of the evidence they had been examining. "Inspector, might we borrow the vestry candle for a moment? I believe Lady Bantry has an excellent point to demonstrate." With some reluctance, Inspector Slack retrieved the candle from the vestry, relighting it with one of Percy's matches from the Blue Boar. Miss Marple carefully held a corner of Lady Bantry's silk scarf near the flame, not close enough to ignite it, but near enough for the heat to affect the fabric. The result was immediate and instructive. The silk, when exposed to the heat, curled away from the flame in the characteristic manner of natural fibers, but it did not melt or form the sort of beaded residue they had observed on the celluloid comb tooth. "Silk behaves quite differently from celluloid when heated," Miss Marple observed. "Natural fibers curl and retreat from flame, while celluloid melts and forms those distinctive beads we found on the comb." Dr. Haydock nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. Someone with knowledge of material properties deliberately chose celluloid items to create specific effects when exposed to flame. The melted comb tooth was not accidental. It was carefully engineered to suggest a particular type of mishap." Miss Marple was thinking about the various elements of deception that had been employed. The burnt hair smell was created deliberately using harvested wig hair. The celluloid comb was melted to suggest an accident with heated styling tools, and the curling tongs were kept warm on the gas ring to maintain the illusion of recent use. "But why go to such elaborate lengths?" Lady Bantry asked. "Surely murder might be accomplished more simply." "Because," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "the timing was crucial. Miss Lang's death needed to appear to have occurred at a specific moment, just before the demonstration began, rather than at some earlier time. The burnt hair smell provided a sort of temporal signature, suggesting the death had happened immediately before discovery." Inspector Slack was beginning to see the full scope of the deception, so the murderer could have killed Miss Lang earlier, and then returned to create the false evidence just before raising the alarm? "Precisely, Inspector, and that would explain why the various elements of the stage scene seemed so carefully coordinated. Someone had time to prepare each detail methodically rather than having to improvise in the moments following an impulsive crime." Mrs. Dacre had been listening to this analysis with growing resignation, her earlier distress giving way to a kind of weary acceptance. "She never understood," she said quietly, so softly that the others had to strain to hear her words. "Miss Lang never understood what it was like for those of us who survived but had to live with the consequences." Miss Marple set down the scarf and turned her full attention to the caretaker. "Mrs. Dacre, were you at St. Cyprian's in 1931? "I was the laundry maid," Mrs. Dacre replied, her voice growing stronger as she began to speak. "Just 19 years old, trying to make an honest living. My little girl, my little Sarah, was one of the children in the dormitory." The admission created a profound silence. Lady Bantry's hand went to her throat in an involuntary gesture of sympathy, while Dr. Haydock's professional composure softened with human understanding. "Miss Lang was the matron, then?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Dacre continued, her words coming more easily now that she'd begun. "She had rules, you see. Everything had to be just so. No exceptions, no flexibility. The children's hair ribbons were always dried over the gas ring in the laundry room. She insisted it was more efficient than hanging them to dry naturally." Miss Marple could see where this narrative was leading, and she felt that familiar chill that always accompanied the recognition of how small acts of negligence could lead to enormous tragedy. "The night of the fire," Mrs. Dacre went on, "Miss Lang had locked the corridor door that connected the dormitory to the main exit. She said it prevented the children from wandering about after lights out. made the building more secure. But when the fire started, her voice broke slightly before she regained control. The children couldn't escape. The main stairway was blocked by flames, and the corridor door was locked. Miss Lang had the key, but by the time she could be roused and the door opened, it was too late for some of them. "Including your daughter," Miss Marple said gently. "Including my Sarah, 7 years old with hair like spun gold." Miss Lang kept a lock of it in that mourning brooch. Said it was to remember the tragedy, to honor the victims. But I knew better. She kept it as insurance, proof of her own guilt in case anyone ever tried to hold her accountable. The room had grown very quiet. The only sound the steady ticking of the clock and the distant murmur of village life continuing beyond the walls of the parish hall. Inspector Slack was writing steadily in his notebook, but his usual brisk efficiency had been tempered by the human tragedy that was unfolding before them. "For 23 years, Mrs. Dacre continued, "I've worked for her in one capacity or another, first at the hospital, then here at the hall. She never let me forget what she knew. Never let me escape the reminders of that night. And when she decided to write to the newspaper to make her story public, you couldn't allow her to present herself as someone seeking justice," Miss Marple concluded, "when you knew she bore responsibility for what had happened." Mrs. Dacre nodded slowly. She was going to give them that brooch as evidence, present herself as someone who had kept a memento of the tragedy out of respect for the victims. But I knew the truth about why she really kept it. Chapter 10. Evening Song and the Hand That Held the Flame. The evening light had begun to fade by the time the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, casting long shadows through the parish hall windows and lending an air of melancholy to what had already become a profoundly sorrowful afternoon. Miss Marple sat in the Clements' sitting room some hours later, having been invited by the vicar and his wife to help them make sense of the tragic events that had unfolded in their parish hall. "It seems almost impossible to believe," Griselda Clement said, settling her baby more comfortably in her arms. Mrs. Dacre always seemed so reliable, so thoroughly respectable, to think that she carried such pain for all those years. Reverend Clement nodded gravely from his position by the fireplace. "The weight of grief can transform people in ways we never anticipate. 23 years is a long time to nurse such wounds." Miss Marple sat down her teacup and considered how best to explain the complex web of motive, method, and opportunity that had led to Miss Lang's death. The confession that had finally emerged from Mrs. Dacre had been both heartbreaking and illuminating, revealing depths of resentment and desperation that had fed for more than 2 decades. The method itself was quite straightforward once one understood the elaborate deception that surrounded it, she began. Mrs. Dacre used Percy Blunt's towel as a ligature. The strong cotton fabric provided exactly the sort of grip and leverage needed for strangulation. The brown smear and singed thread we found on the towel were evidence of its use as a garrote, and the subsequent attempt to eliminate traces by brushing it against flame. She paused to sip her tea before continuing. The genius of the crime lay not in its execution, but in the careful staging that followed. Mrs. Dacre understood that timing would be crucial to avoiding detection. If Miss Lang's death appeared to occur moments before discovery, no one would think to question where the various participants had been during the earlier part of the afternoon. Reverend Clement frowned thoughtfully. But how did she manage to create such an elaborate false scene while maintaining her normal duties as caretaker? That was perhaps the most clever aspect of her plan, Miss Marple replied. Her position as caretaker provided perfect cover for moving freely throughout the building, accessing all areas, and explaining her presence anywhere it might be questioned. Who would think twice about seeing Mrs. Dacre in the kitchenette, the vestry, or anywhere else she might need to go. She began to enumerate the various elements of the deception. First, she harvested hair from Miss Crowther's demonstration wig during the setup period, when everyone was busy with their own preparations. The missing wig provided the raw material for creating that powerful burnt hair smell that so effectively suggested an accident with curling tongs. Griselda shuddered slightly. That smell was dreadful, so acrid and penetrating. Exactly. And that was deliberate. Mrs. Dacre needed the odor to be strong enough to persist for several minutes, creating a clear sensory impression that would fix the apparent time of death in everyone's memory. She used the gas ring in the kitchenette to keep the spirit pan at a moderate temperature, then transferred Percy's curling tongs to the vestry, where they would feel appropriately warm without showing signs of the extreme heat that genuine hair styling would require. Miss Marple reached for a biscuit before continuing her explanation. The celluloid comb was particularly clever. She knew that celluloid melts and forms distinctive beads when exposed to flame, creating exactly the sort of evidence one might expect from an accident with heated styling equipment. But the precision of the melting, affecting only one tooth, while leaving the rest untouched, revealed the deliberate nature of the damage. "And the scorch marks at the wrong height?" Reverend Clement asked. Those occurred when she crouched by the vestry curtain to burn the harvested wig hair, creating the smell that would support her deception. The wax drips on the floor came from carrying a lighted candle while she arranged the various elements of the full scene. The fiber we found in one of the wax drops matched the coarse thread of her work apron. Miss Marple's expression grew more somber as she approached the heart of the matter. But the most calculated aspect of her crime was the replacement of hair in Miss Lang's mourning brooch. She knew that Miss Lang intended to present the brooch as evidence of the matron's supposedly compassionate preservation of a victim's hair, when in fact it had always been kept as a form of protection against potential accusations. "Protection?" Griselda asked. Miss Lang kept the original brooch because it contained Sarah Dacre's hair, marked with a scarlet thread, physical proof that she had been responsible for the child's presence in the dormitory on the night of the fire. But Mrs. Dacre replaced that hair with more strands from the demonstration wig, eliminating the identifying mark and rendering Miss Lang's intended evidence worthless. The full scope of the deception was staggering in its complexity and forethought. Mrs. Dacre had not simply committed murder in a moment of passion, but had constructed an elaborate framework of false evidence designed to protect her from detection, while simultaneously destroying the proof that Miss Lang had intended to use in her newspaper revelation. Why did she confess in the end? Reverend Clement wondered. Miss Marple considered this question carefully. "I believe it was partly relief and partly the weight of accumulated evidence. The physical clues were becoming impossible to explain away, and she realized that her careful plan was unraveling piece by piece. But more than that, I think she was tired of carrying such a burden of grief and anger." She sat down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap. Mrs. Dacre told Inspector Slack that she had originally intended only to frighten Miss Lang, to make her understand the pain that her threatened revelation would cause. But when Miss Lang refused to abandon her plans and spoke of finally setting the record straight, Mrs. Dacre's control snapped. "The strangling came first?" Griselda asked quietly. "Yes. It was swift, and according to Dr. Haydock, probably occurred well before the beauty demonstration was scheduled to begin. Everything else, the burnt hair smell, the positioned evidence, the tampered brooch, was staged afterward to create the impression of a recent accident. The tragedy of the situation was not lost on any of them. Mrs. Dacre had lived for 23 years with the knowledge that her daughter's death could have been prevented by more flexible thinking and less rigid adherence to rules. Miss Lang's threatened revelation had promised not justice, but a distorted version of events that would have presented the former matron as a grieving memorial keeper, rather than acknowledging her role in the tragedy. Inspector Slack seemed quite overwhelmed by the complexity of it all, Miss Marple observed with a slight smile. I suspect he would have preferred a more straightforward case of obvious motive and clear evidence. Later, as she walked home through the quiet village streets, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of guilt and the ways in which past actions could reach across decades to claim new victims. The beauty demonstration had been intended as a celebration of transformation and renewal, but it had instead become the final act in a tragedy that began with a locked door and dried hair ribbons in 1931. Lady Bantry, walking beside her in companionable silence, finally spoke. That smell, Jane. So intimate, you said earlier. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Hair is memory, my dear. The poor keep it. In brooches, the vain in boxes. People think burning it leaves nothing behind. It nearly always leaves a little tidy something. The evening bells had begun to ring for evensong as they reached Miss Marple's gate, their sound carrying across the village with the sort of peaceful regularity that made St. Mary Me feel like a place where such terrible secrets should not be able to take root and flourish. But Miss Marple knew better than most that even the most tranquil communities could harbor the deepest wounds, and that justice, when it finally came, often arrived wearing the most unexpected face.